had all this reporting in your life, you've done all these things, you look up one day and you say, that gets me, I want to go do that. What was it?
Well, it wasn't quite that simple. I wrote a book about inequality in the economy. I was going around the country giving talks about the book, talking about increased wealth at the top and problems in the political system. And people started saying, what are we going to do about it? What's happening? And I started to ask them. I didn't really know. I knew a little bit what was going on, but I didn't know much. So as I was traveling the country, I began to find out something's going on in North Dakota, something's going on in North Carolina, something's going on in Massachusetts or California or whatever. And I just began to collect those stories on a website.
Right.
And then after I'd done that for quite a while, one of my producers heard me giving a talk at Amherst, Massachusetts, at Amherst College. She said, Rick, you should do a documentary about that. Well, I've been making documentaries. I'd shut down my company, and I said, I'm out of that business. She said, I'll do all the scut work. I'll hire all the people.
That's great.
Yeah. I'll raise the money, which she didn't do. I raised the money, so what happened was I really tumbled into it. It was not something I said, oh, I'm going to go cover that. But I ought to say one thing, Ross. I spent a lot of years as a foreign correspondent.
Right.
And what that told me was if you cover a country, you can't sit in the Capitol. You cover a state, you can't sit in the Capitol. You got to get out in the country. So getting out in the country and seeing what was going on in America was something I did after I came back from Saigon and Cairo and Moscow. So being out there, looking at what was going on was something that always intrigued me in a way that I don't think most Washington reporters think about.
Right. Was there a particular kind of thing that got your attention? I'm wondering, were the grievances like high-level, sophisticated, well, our voter ID law does this or that, or was it, I just can't seem to vote? I mean, what kinds of things were you hearing that got this going?
I think what really got me was literally interaction with audiences. People would stand up and they were angry. And they would, we can't vote, or there's no point in my voting. I mean, young people would stand up and say, I live in a gerrymandered district, and there's no point in my voting. Or I'm an independent, I can't vote in a party primary.
Right.
Or I can't see where the dark money is. I mean the visceral anger, so much of it now is focused around Trump, pro or con, that people think it all happened under Trump, and it really didn't. It's been building for the last 20, 25 years. So when I'm out there doing this 5 or 6 years ago, before Trump has even declared he's running, people are really head up. And as Keith said earlier, the polls were showing 70, 80% of the people saying Washington doesn't care about people like me, lobbyists have too much power, corporations have bought Washington. So those attitudes are really embedded. So I'm starting to hear stuff from individual people. And what got me was, you haven't seen the Washington State story, was the individual heroes.
Right.
These are great stories. And a good reporter recognizes that. Suddenly you've got a woman who's never been in politics. She's been an aircraft mechanic. She's run a private business. She's been a family counselor. And she gets so head up about Citizens United, she's got to go do something. Well, and then she starts organizing, and you begin to, it's infectious. Courage is infectious. And as I say, as a good reporter, man, you just say, wow, that's a story.
Right.
Or I'm up in Connecticut. And I go up there and I meet Gary Winfield, who you're going to hear from in a moment. Right. But I meet Marilyn Moore. This is an African-American woman who says she comes from a poor community. She had kids when she was young. She was on food stamps. She runs a nonprofit for African-American women who have breast cancer. And she's in the state legislature because of public funding. I said, my God, that is a revolution. When that can happen. So my ears just perked up. If I was in Russia and I ran into that, if I was in Cairo and I ran into that, it's a story which I would have told. So it's really natural.
Well, I have to say I was a little disappointed. You kind of hit 4 areas: dark money, gerrymandering, voter suppression, and I'm going to do a Rick Perry and forget the 4th one. Oops.
Public funding.
Citizens United.
Citizens United. Voters' rights.
And Texas has all of these, and somehow we didn't make your top 5 list.
Listen, I'm ready to come back. I'm ready. I'll do a sequel.
We're ready to see it. I wondered how much of what you saw was the same in every state. The sort of the same, different responses, but the same problems.
Well, there are a lot of...
And how much of it is just really geographic?
There are a lot of these things that interlock. When you say Texas has them all, North Carolina has them, the voting rights thing, the gerrymandering, that kind of stuff. But, the dynamics are different. There's certain things that really really aggravate people. And in lots of states I go to, people are really aggravated by out-of-state money. Now, you're a big state, your money flows elsewhere, New York, California. But if you go to a state like South Dakota, even North Carolina, you go to a state like almost in the Middle West even, money's coming from New York, money's coming from California, money's coming from Texas.
Right.
Why are those people trying to affect us?
Right.
So there's a real, it's a visceral resentment. So that's an issue that can suddenly get exercised. In Connecticut, you have a bunch of corruption. And suddenly the governor is out, and lo and behold, who turns around and wants reform? The Republican lieutenant governor who succeeds him.
Right.
And it's the Democrats who are saying, no, we can raise more money here in Connecticut. We don't like reform.
Right.
So it's, the dynamics aren't the same. Lots of the problems are, and they tend to reinforce each other. If you've got gerrymander problems, you've probably got voting rights problems.
Right.
If you've got voting rights problems and gerrymander problems, you've probably got dark money problems. And so on it goes.
Right.
And then if you have nonpartisan primaries, as they do in California and Washington, or you have public funding of campaigns, as you do in Connecticut, you begin to get on the path of fixing things. But who's going to say to you, Ross, when you're in North Dakota, that a bunch of women in their 60s are so upset about corruption in North Dakota politics, which is not one of those states that immediately jumps to mind, right? Right. They form a group and they call themselves the badass grandmas of North Dakota. And they say,
I love that. Sorry, it's like they should have bikes or something, right?
I mean, what it tells you is there's something electric going on, and people are getting the idea. We've been telling politicians to fix it. We've been voting them in. We tried this other office. We tried term limits. Nobody's doing anything. We got to do it ourselves. That's what really catches my eye.
So were the states that you chose and the movements that you saw, and the reform movements that you saw, generally the product of something going, at least in the minds of the reformers, terribly wrong? Connecticut's easy because the governor's a crook.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's true. No, I mean, if you look at Citizens United, there are 20 states that have passed it. We happen to do it in Washington State. But it was like a prairie fire in Colorado.
Right.
I just got there too late. It already happened, and I want to see to film a reform movement that was underway and not one that had happened. But in Colorado, it was transpartisan. 74% majorities Republican. Every single county in the state, all 65 counties, all the red counties, all the blue counties, all the purple counties, they all voted around 70% in favor of repealing Citizens United. Right. So it's a mushrooming kind of explosion. It is a real rebellion that's going on. So that wasn't triggered by anything. It was triggered by a decision by the Supreme Court. In North Carolina, it's clearly triggered by an abuse. There's a particular law that's being pushed through by the state legislature, and a modern Martin Luther King manages a movement. One of the interesting things to me about that, I'm amazed every time I see that segment. Did you notice who was getting arrested by the carload? Mm-hmm. I mean, I covered the civil rights movement. It was African-American college and high school students, and there were some white sprinkled in from college. Bucket loads of people being arrested in North Carolina were white. Right. And they said this is an unjust system. So it wasn't just the people who were being denied their rights. It was lots of other people saying, this isn't fair, this isn't square. And that's what's impressive to me.
Did you find a place, this is a little unfair, this occurred to me while I was watching this, you can think of places like Texas that hit for the cycle, all four of your things, right? Are there places that you found or places that you know of where all of this seems to work? Is there a model state, or is it a piece of this and a little bit of that?
Yeah, no, I don't, probably the closest is California, because all the Western states are helped. Pretty much all the Western states are helped because they have ballot initiatives.
Right.
So you don't have a ballot initiative here. So
right,
you've got to get reform through the people who are really the source of the problem. That's pretty tough to do. So if you're in the Western states like California, Washington State, Montana, which is, believe it or not, a significant reform state, it's largely because when people get fed up, they can go around the legislature. One of my favorite sources is a guy in your state whom you probably know, Ernie Cortez.
Sure.
The Hispanic vote organizer and political reform organizer. One of the things he said to me really resonated. He said, Rick, they say power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. He said powerlessness also corrupts. It corrupts democracy at the core. And I think when you have states where people feel powerless, not much happens. People have to re-empower themselves. And that's what's amazing here, is that people suddenly said, oh, screw it. They're not going to do it. We got to do it.
Right.
I mean, this woman, Katie Fay, a 25-year-old graduate student in Michigan, puts a Facebook post out saying she's upset by the gerrymander in Michigan. Within 1 week, she has 5,000 responses, and she starts a reform movement called Voters Not Politicians. So, the badass grandmothers, Katie Fay, the woman in Washington State you haven't seen. I mean, Barber is a much more organized, he's been head of the state NACP. He's a guy who's been on voters' rights. It's a much more purposeful, long-term thing. But a lot of this is really spontaneous combustion.
Right. When you set out, you had this I guess, a parade of grievances. You had a bunch of things collected. And then you went out and talked to people, and as you were doing the documentary, did it change your mind about anything? As you were talking to these people, did you see something that you hadn't seen when you started this? Did it change your thinking?
I learned something that I should have known before I started.
It's always the best reporting, right?
I learned something that I should have known, and that is people in power do not give up power easily. Right. If you notice in North Carolina, they get the court decision. What do the politicians do? They go back and they find a way around the court decision. They frame a resolution, they get it passed by the voters, and they've come back.
Right.
And it's going on in Michigan and North Dakota now. The legislators are trying to unroll the reform. So it is a real lesson. There's a wonderful quote from a woman at Washington State. She said, democracy, you've got to fight for it. If you don't, it'll slip right through your fingers. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we all know politics, it's not a spectator sport. It's a participatory sport. But it's also a hang-in-there sport. Right. And that, I was really amazed in some ways by the people who got that lesson and hung in and didn't quit. I mean, Gary Winfield and the people in Connecticut, their leadership, his own party's leadership was trying to find a way to save money in the state budget. And of all things, this not very expensive program, $30 million is not a hell of a lot of money.
Right. They
wanted to get rid of it, and it's the backbenchers who rose up in both parties against them. So, I mean, it never ends. And I know that. And you sort of think about that when you're looking at Russia, and you think about that when you're looking at the Middle East. These are never-ending problems, right? But we're smart enough in this country to enact reforms, and that should take care of it. We can walk away. You can't ever walk away.
Right.
And I knew that in my head, but I didn't know it in my gut. I didn't have the feel for it. And seeing these stories, seeing these people, I learned that again.
Did you see some big failures along the way? I mean, you did 5 states in the full hour of this.
6, yeah.
6, okay.
Yeah.
I wonder if you went to some places and you were watching a particular thing take place, a fight over voter ID or a fight over gerrymandering, whatever it was, and it just petered out.
Well, it wasn't just that. Yeah, absolutely, I saw that.
Yeah.
As you know, reporting is like going for oil. You drill a lot of dry wells, right? So when we went out we were really starting to film this in 2016 during the campaign 2016. We went and filmed more stories than we were going to be able to eventually put in the film because we didn't know which ones would turn out to be interesting stories. It wasn't just success, but was the story interesting? Right. So when we were in Washington State, we were covering them working against Citizens United. We were also in South Dakota where they were pushing a public funding bill to publicly fund elections. And there was a public funding proposal in Washington State. Now, Washington State is a hell of a lot more favorable to this kind of reform than South Dakota is.
Right.
But interestingly enough, it succeeded in South Dakota and it failed in Washington State. What did I learn from that? The Washington State one was funded by a bunch of people from New York, by Craig Ballmer's wife, the former CEO of Microsoft, put in $500,000. A bunch of rich people did it. They paid for somebody to go get the signatures to put the thing on the ballot, and they got it on the ballot. But when they went to vote for it, they didn't have any base.
Right.
Whereas the people who had gone
like
out and collected the signatures,
right.
and they did it grassroots from the bottom up in South Dakota, they won.
Right.
So what I saw was money can actually work against you even if you're working for reform. So, I mean, money isn't the automatic advantage. There is something electric about people getting involved and the achievement. I mean, in Washington State, they get 300,000 signatures. In Michigan, 400,000 signatures. In Florida, I don't know if you heard the number, it goes by very fast, 1.5 million signatures they had to collect. Well, what that does to people is it gives them a stake in it. So when you go to the election,
Right.
that's not enough to pass it, but it gives you one hell of a base, and people are saying, yeah, that is the right thing to do, and I did sign up for that, and you know, and they talk to their neighbors about it. So I mean, it was interesting. It isn't a new discovery, but it's a rediscovery that's valuable. It's the same thing as I said, the bad guys or the power brokers hang on to power. Grassroots effort really is contagious. Courage is contagious. The effort is contagious. And that's reassuring. I mean, in the kind of time we live in right now, I mean, I think it's a great story.
Does the contagion cross state lines? I'm just curious. I mean, if you I mean,
know, it's astonishing.
It's interesting seeing this. You know, I'm not aware of the thing in South Dakota until I see this.
Absolutely.
You know, I remember some of the Florida stuff. I particularly like where the Jacksonville Seahorse came back a little bit skinnier, but it was still a
it was even more
Seahorse.
gerrymandered. It was worse gerrymandered the second time around. Yeah.
We have a district that competes with that on the top 10 most most redistricted maps every year.
The Democrats in Maryland have another candidate, so it's not just Republicans.
So, I mean, does this contagion go over state lines? If they have a big movement in South Dakota, does everybody from North Dakota kind of look over and does it spread? Or do you have to have something go haywire in each state?
Astonishingly, the answer is no. It does actually happen in the Dakotas, that they had the push in South Dakota, and that did help the North Dakota people. That's the only example I can think of. Massachusetts has a public funding program which got enacted by ballot initiative, but the legislators didn't like it, so they didn't fund it adequately, so it doesn't work. So you have Connecticut right next door to Massachusetts, right next door to New Hampshire, right next door to New York. Each one of those states have fooled around with public funding. As far as I can tell, they haven't learned a damn thing from Connecticut.
Yeah.
This is ours. It's not invented here. It's terrible. I mean, I think that's one reason why the failure of the media, the national media, to cover this as a movement story. I mean, it gets covered if there's an election victory for one day. It gets covered if there's a court decision on gerrymandering for one day.
Right.
But the notion that there's something going, I happen to think there's something percolating in America today, which is similar to the progressive era. Has it gone as far? No. But it's incipient. It's coming. And the same thing with the civil rights movement. It doesn't get carried that way, so people don't have a way of learning what the hell's going on.
Describe that movement to me a little bit, to the extent that you can.
Well, I mean, the two most obvious elements of that movement are the League of Women Voters and Common Cause. The League of Women Voters is everywhere in the country, and it's trying to register people to vote, and it's trying to make election laws fair.
Right.
And then you have Common Causes in probably 30 different states. It doesn't have as many states represented, and they're working on some of the same thing. But there's a slew of organizations. I went to a conference, to cover a conference in Nashville, Tennessee back in March. I would say there were 500 different organizations there. It reminded me of the civil rights movement. I mean, there's Represent Us, there's American Promise, there's In the Public Interest. The list goes on and on. And some of these are fly-by-nights. They'll come and they'll go. More of them are now 4 or 5 years old. Some of them are very Washington, New York centered, and they just like I just told you about the Washington State thing. They're trying to push money and ideas out. Doesn't work terribly well. Others are smart enough to realize that if you organize state by state, and it comes from the bottom up, it tends to work better.
Right.
But there is a real infrastructure now. There are many more movements. When I first covered this, there are a whole bunch of organizations that now exist that didn't exist when I first started looking into this 5 years ago.
How'd you pick these 4 things? The gerrymandering, Citizens United, that list. I mean, there's a whole range of things. There's an old joke that if they wanted you to vote, they would make it easy. And there are all of these things that they have in place to make it a little more difficult or more secure, or however they couch it.
Yeah.
How'd you pick these 4 things?
Well, I think you gotta look at voting. I mean, if you're gonna look at American elections, you gotta look at voting. So you can't avoid looking at that one. And I think the next thing is you really have to look at district lines. Gerrymandering has been a problem in American politics since 1812. Eldridge Gerry, the Democrats in Massachusetts. So it's been with us forever. But what I discovered in my reporting when I started to do research was that the Republicans in 2010, for the first time, took gerrymandering nationwide. They had a program called Red Map, And what they figured out was if they could get control of enough state legislatures, they could do the gerrymandering for in 2011 for the 2012 elections and from then on. They did something that's never been done in American history before. They flipped 17 legislatures by going after 116 legislative seats. Now, there's 6,000 or so legislative seats around the country.
Right.
Karl Rove was in the center of that, your Texas political guru, and a bunch of other people, and they doped out what they had to do. They spent $30 million. They spent next to nothing in American politics, and they flipped it. And they flipped it in such a way that in Pennsylvania, where the vote is pretty much 50-50, Republicans got 13 seats, Democrats got 5 for the House.
Right.
In North Carolina, same thing, 10-3. Before it had been 7 Democrats. So they went around in a bunch of states, and you run right from the Middle West. So I saw that phenomenon. Again, that's the reporter's instinct,
Sure.
really good story. I hadn't even seen that story in print in the New York Times and the Washington Post. It had been in a couple of books, maybe a couple of buried magazine articles. So, well, that's
Political scientists noticed
yeah,
it.
Yeah. And so political scientists. And so, it's a hell of a story. So I'm going to go after that. So, I got those two. Then money. Everybody's upset about money. And Citizens United really triggered a whole lot of resentment and rebellion. So I had to go cover that. But as I looked at that, I thought, this is a really long process. How the hell are they ever going to get there? Is there some other alternative to that? And that's how I got to the public funding. That's another way of dealing with it. So I was beginning, as I got into it, I began to ask of myself what I thought of as more sophisticated questions, and they led me to other things. But we could have covered, we could now be covering, the Electoral College. There's a whole movement to change the Electoral College. We could be covering the nonpartisan primary that is really effective in Washington State and California. So, and we could be covering ranked choice voting. Some of these reforms got momentum after I got going.
Right.
And I was interested in filming reforms that had happened, but also were in place so I could see, as in Connecticut, what's the impact of that? Or there's a story about dark money in California, which is a really neat detective story. Of course, part of it is also, I did Frontline there, which is investigative journalism. So a little bit of investigative journalism is fun, like this Florida story. There's another one that exposes the Koch network in California. So part of it was a sense that journalistically I needed to have a mix of grassroots movement and then a kind of sophisticated battle. And if I was thinking about getting an audience interested nationwide, I needed to be in the Middle West. I needed to be in the Far West.
Right.
So
a pin in
all
the map,
all those things. And now with PBS, that matters a lot.
So the whole hour is available?
The whole hour will be available on PBS in January.
Okay.
I hope it's on your Austin station, not opposite the opening night of the World Series or something like that.
It's tough, isn't it?
Anyway, it's coming in January, and then it will be up on the internet. We'll have it, and hopefully we're going to make it available, as PBS often does, to universities and so forth, so people can teach. I've had a lot of luck with documentaries I've made that have gone into the educational system. I'm interested in getting the word out to the folks in this audience tonight and to your campuses right here and all across this great state.
Great. Well, I've seen the whole hour. It's really, really great. It's a nice piece of work.
Good.
Nice piece of work. We've got another thing here, and then we'll be back up in a little bit. I want to introduce Josh Hinkle, who is the Director of Investigations and Innovation at KXAN here. He's got a panel, and then I think you and I come back up and answer some questions.
Thanks so much, Ross.
Pleasure.
I really enjoyed it.
Pleasure.
right, thank you to the organizers for tonight's event. I'm Josh Hinkle, and on behalf of KXAN, we appreciate the opportunity to partner tonight to help continue this conversation with these insightful panelists. Next, Gary Winfield is serving his 4th term as a Connecticut state senator. You saw him in the documentary. After serving 3 terms in the Connecticut House of Representatives. As a state senator, all right. As a state senator, he has focused on reshaping conversations around criminal justice, juvenile justice, and immigration policy, and has been a strong supporter, as you saw, of the state's publicly funded campaign system. Dana DeBevois is the Travis County Clerk here in Austin. Let's get some applause for her. There we go. Since her election as county clerk in 1986, one of her main focuses has been on the conduct of elections, including secure voting systems, and ushering in an early voting program centered on customer-friendly polling locations and high-traffic retail locations. And Anthony Gutierrez is the executive director of Common Cause Texas. There we go. Focusing on legislative advocacy and grassroots organizing. His group says it aims to reduce the influence of money in politics, end partisan gerrymandering, and improve access to the election process. Welcome, each of you. Thank you for being with us. I'd like to start with you, Senator Winfield. You've been a proponent of your state's Clean Election Fund and public financing in general. Where does that fund stand, and is it still working?
The fund is still working. It is largely used, as was suggested in the video, by most of the people who are running for office. As the video suggested, there was a culture shift. And if you don't use the fund, the first question that the public asks is, why are you not invested in this fund? So it's still in place. But one of the things that has happened is, over the course of time, as Hedrick suggested in the last panel, there have been attacks on the fund. So periodically, we have to stand up and push back on that.
Yeah, so there is a 5-member bipartisan citizens committee, the State Elections Enforcement Commission in your state, in charge of administering the citizen election program, and it has historically sided with citizens who have wanted to see the program continue, even as lawmakers have suggested cutting the funding, especially during tough budget years.
We've cut the funding for them. So when they cannot get to the program, they will go after the State Elections Enforcement Commission.
Do you think, even with those challenges, could something work in a state like Texas where the government is even bigger?
I think this kind of a program could work anywhere. I think what would have to happen is, first, I think it's not an instantaneous thing. I think what would have to happen is there would have to be a story told about why this is valuable to the people. And not just the way that we normally tell a story where it's like, this would make the elections clean. I don't know what value it has to me. I think people have to recognize that it allows entrance into our political system in a way that other systems do not. As I suggested in the video, I never would have been able to run under any other system. I was not born into a family that was politically involved in that way. I wasn't connected to people. As a matter of fact, I had become a community activist, and I had upset most of the people who were in politics. So it just would not have been fathomable that I would be involved in the way that I am.
For that State Elections Enforcement Commission, how do you find that 5-member bipartisan citizens committee? How do you make sure that they're actually bipartisan and that they're going to do everything in the best interest of the people?
So I couldn't tell you that right off the top of my head. I don't remember the process by which we do that. So I guess I would just leave that there.
Okay. Well, the program has provided the same amount of funding for incumbents and challengers, which could decrease the advantage for incumbents, make them more accountable to their constituents by by keeping the elections tighter. As studies have shown, full public financing can translate to smaller margins of victory. How have you seen it exactly change the face of government? Clearly, we have different people in office than when this all started.
So I guess I was trying to be funny by saying good, but I was also being very serious. I think it is good. I think all of us who are elected should have the potential for a real challenge. What it has done, first by allowing people in who otherwise weren't in, has changed our politics. So the Democratic Party we're not a left country, but it's a more left Democratic Party than it was. it has allowed for challenges to happen. So in my situation, I didn't have an incumbent who I was running against, but I did have an individual who was backed by the party, who was elected in the local town, who was supposed to be the person who won. In other districts in that year, you had a lot of people who were younger who ran that would not have run. You had people under the age of 30 who were running that would not have run. Subsequent to that, our Black and Puerto Rican caucus, at the time that I entered the legislature, we had about 20 people. We now have about 30 people. We weren't on the rise. That's part of the outgrowth of having a public financing system. And people often will tell you, because I've done some of this work across the country, people often tell you, well, if you have a publicly financed system of campaigns, you're going to harm communities of color. I would tell you it's exactly the opposite, because that bar that has changed allows for people to run that would not be able to run.
And you're speaking to people that the people in office previously might not have never spoken to. You're going and knocking on different doors now too, right?
Yeah, the example that I give is the woman who only has $5 to give. Why under any other system would you ever talk to her? If you can get $2,500 in some room, why would you talk to anybody with why would you talk to the person at the top end with $100? You just wouldn't. You would try to get the people with the biggest ability to give. The part of this system that makes it really important is not just the $5 to $100, but the number of people you have to get in your district so that that $5 actually counts. Because once you get the $5 from that woman, you take one off of the 150, 200, whatever number your particular district has to have.
What barriers do you see to this working in other places? What challenges have you guys faced beyond kind of those funding concerns?
I think the biggest barrier is that the people who are already in the system don't want to be able to be challenged. That is still true today in Connecticut. There are people still today, as Karen Hobart Flynn suggested, that are out smiling and saying what a great system it is, but behind the scenes they're trying to kill this system. Because if we go backwards, you have incumbency protection. And so I think no matter where you go, whether it's a red state, a blue state, or a purple state, people who are in power are going to try to maintain that power. And so they do not want a system like this, because this makes every single one of us vulnerable. And you have to spend the time in your district. You have to talk to people who you otherwise don't have to talk to. Big money can't do anything. Lobbyists are useless. The currency that lobbyists in Connecticut swim in is information. It's not money. It's not that they can buy anything for you. It is information, and that changes what it is to even be a lobbyist in our state.
Now, I've read that one of your concerns has been politicians in your state revealing in real time, or as close to real time as possible, how and who is funding their campaigns. What does that look like today?
Under the system, and this is where we normally talk about campaign finance reform. Normally we're talking about disclosure and the upper limits. But in Connecticut, as you go through the system, there are periods in time continuously where you have to put forward who are the people funding your campaign, or you get fined, and you have serious fines. And I think that's important, because without that, we have a local campaign finance system in New Haven, and we've seen people in that system who've just said, well, there's no real punishment, and so we'll just allow this to run. And yeah, they get the negative press, but they're not really getting punished. I think it's important to the system that we have real punishments for not obeying the rules of the system.
And seeing that transparency faster.
You see the transparency faster. It's posted online. Anybody can go and see not just the database, but they can go see your actual forms. They can look at your forms as they were. The actual forms are uploaded. So you get the database, but you also get the forms. So if there's an inconsistency that got missed, the public can actually see it.
Where do you want to see the system go next? What's the evolving point for it in your mind?
So I want to protect the system that we have in Connecticut, and the reason why I'm here and have traveled to New York, which we haven't gotten it quite right yet, is because I want to expand this to other places. I think largely when the federal government can't do what it's supposed to do, and on this question, I don't think we're really even close. It is the states that change the way that we function in this country, and I think by allowing voices that are never really in our system in the way that they are now in Connecticut, we could have a fundamental change to what it is to operate an election in this country.
Thank you very much. Next, let's turn to Travis County Clerk Dana DeBeauvoir. Thousands of Texans' votes were thrown out in recent elections after they showed up to vote at the wrong polling place on election day, and many other potential voters have shown up at the wrong location and just not voted. As some experts predict the 2020 presidential election could draw people to the polls like never before, some county election officials have been working to move past precinct-based voting and instead open every polling place to voters regardless of where they live. How is that working?
That approach is called vote centers. We have our own history with vote centers right here in Travis County. Following the 2010 census, Travis County was just carved up so badly. We ended up going to a vote center program in 2011 for the very reason that had I left us in a position of using precinct-based polling, thousands and thousands of voters in 2011 would have lost their right to vote. And what I mean by that is they would have shown up at their precinct polling place thinking that they were in the right place. And depending on what time of day they showed up, they may or may not have had the time, the opportunity to go back to the gerrymandered place where they were supposed to show up and cast a vote, given child and work obligations and traffic in Travis County. They might not have made it back over to what was their new, now correct polling place. The best way to counter a gerrymandered district like the multiple gerrymandered districts that Travis County was faced with in 2011 is to move to a vote center kind of approach. Well, in 2011, to tell you the truth, Travis County was not ready to implement a vote center. You have to be connected real time to a copy of the voter registration roll in order to make sure that you don't have people going from place to place and double voting. I mean, there are a lot of highly technical things that you have to have in place in order to properly conduct an election under a vote center scenario, and we did not have it ready. The alternative, though, was for us to simply sit back and watch thousands of voters be deliberately disenfranchised. So we took a risk, and we said we're going to go for vote centers. I would rather make a mistake in bringing up a vote center and have a technical problem than to have a moral mistake and watch voters be deliberately disenfranchised. So we rolled the dice a bit and went for vote centers before we knew we were ready. And we were fortunate. Everything stayed up and connected, and more voters were taken care of than had any kind of technical problems. So it turned out to be the right thing to do. And quite frankly, I didn't share my fear and my concern that we were doing this before before it was ready for prime time, because it was much more important for people to come out to vote and to not be so disheartened over the horrible situation that Travis County had been put in by the drastic gerrymandering that happened to us. Now, the thing about it is that vote centers were invented as a budget-cutting tool. That's where the idea came from. So the idea was you go in and you take out half, if not more, of your precinct polling places, and then typically you're going to open up a vote center in a place that's much larger. It's got better parking, perhaps it's on a bigger roadway, it's more accessible to your voters. And so the idea was that even though you're cutting the number of polling places, you're potentially offering your voters a better place to go vote, to park, to be able to offer voting services. Well, yes and no. So the first thing we did in Travis County was we said, as a practical matter, we will not close one single precinct polling place. We will simply open up every single one of the precinct polling places, call them vote centers, have them all connected, and everybody will show up to vote wherever it is convenient for them. And there is no wrong answer for where you go vote on election day. Now, early voting is, of course, oh, thank you. It was Terry at the time. But no voter can make a mistake for where they go vote. During early voting, what we did was we continued that philosophy for Election Day. We still hold it true today. And vote centers have now turned out to be the way to counter a lot of the problems that have been foisted on voters by folks who don't want to see them voting. And I want to talk some more about how we can figure out good ways that we change around vote centers in order to offer better locations, as opposed to the closing of vote centers that is designed to harm voters. How do we know which story is the truth?
Yeah, that's something related to that. A new state law recently, in effect, effectively bans mobile voting places, something adopted by certain counties to facilitate early voting in places where people have a more difficult time getting to the polls. Travis County has for several years had dozens of temporary polling places like colleges, rural community centers, senior living facilities. Nearly 6% of all Travis County votes were cast at such sites during the 2018 midterm election, which is but it would be costly to turn all temporary sites into permanent polling places, which is what the new law requires. So what happens to those voters who have come to rely on those temporary voting places?
Well, they're stuck. They are absolutely harmed. All right, let me explain just a little bit about what mobile voting is. Mobile voting is a voting program whose philosophy is you take voting services out to a community. Typically, it's rural communities or some community that is, you mentioned, active retirement areas. Perhaps those folks don't get out and go into town or whatnot very often. And so to give them another option besides voting with a by-mail paper ballot, you can also offer to that community the opportunity to bring mobile voting out there. The other option is to bring to big areas with lots of density in their voting area, like, for example, all of the state office buildings and these areas around the university make an ideal place to stop for a visit for a day for mobile voting. So that's what you look for. So the philosophy is, first, rural voters, then perhaps over 65 and disabled voters who are living in communities, and then perhaps high population areas, which would also include shopping as well as but lots of high density. Now we've got all the condo voters. The concept is to bring voting out to an area that is underserved but does not have a sufficient population or a sufficient draw to justify spending money for an entire voting period and bring out a whole voting program for the whole time period. So if you bring out, we would do, in this last election where we were allowed to use mobile voting, we had 61 stops in our one voting period, the 2-week early voting period. The program was the most cost-effective and marvelous thing that we could offer our folks in these low-density areas. For 61 stops, we could bring voting to 30,000 voters for less than $50,000, and we could go to places where perhaps they were having the distribution of WIC, Women and Infants and Children services, or perhaps it was free golf day, and we could get everybody who was coming into out by the lake communities. I mean, there were lots of ways for us to match up their day for voting with community services that were brought in, especially in the southeast area of Travis County, where there are no buildings and very few services out there, or all those areas out in the lake community where there are lots of residences and very little of anything else other than a fabulous view. If Travis County in our calculations were to go and put in a permanent early voting location at each of those 61 day-long stops, roughly, all those locations, it would have cost us $1 million. So clearly replacing all of those mobile voting locations with permanent voting locations was never an option. So that meant the people in those low turnout areas, low density areas who were receiving services we're never going to be able to have those services again. This is a permanent removal of voting services in those areas. We did try to go back and put one extra location out in the lake area and one extra location out in the southeast area. But the whole point was those low-density areas can't justify the expenditure. Now, since that has happened, in fact, it happened on Monday in the Austin American-Statesman, there were two opinions that were written. Mr. Contreras wrote the opinion about vote centers that said, oh, it's a great idea that we got rid of mobile voting, and his the part where I think he really left us all behind in his logic was he said that the loss of mobile voting in these communities was a very good thing, that it leveled the playing field and that the voters in those areas are going to support the loss of mobile voting. He's left me behind. I don't get that. But the idea that mobile voting was ripped away from every single county in the state has, I believe, backfired badly on the people who thought they were harming, I'm not sure who, because what's happened is, who is it that votes in rural red areas in Texas? And who was it in the legislature that decided to kill mobile voting? So I really can't explain to you what the philosophy, what the explanation is for killing the most effective voting program we've ever had in this state. But nevertheless, the ones that are the most harmed, the worst affected by the demise of mobile voting are in fact the rural red parts of Texas. In fact, the people in Travis County that have been the most affected by the loss of mobile voting, are those who live out by the Lake Travis area. I can't explain it to you, but what I can say is that it is yet another cut in services to our voters that we can do nothing about, and it has no logical explanation. And making up stories about how it's a really good thing is not something that I think voters are going to sign on to either.
I think we'll learn a lot in this next election cycle. And as we're continuing our conversation, be thinking about questions if you have any for any of our panelists, because we'll take some questions from the audience after we're done talking. Next, I want to move on to Anthony Gutierrez with Common Cause Texas. In 2021, the state legislature will begin working to redraw voter maps, and the redistricting process, we all know it, which will help decide who represents you in government for the next decade. But for most of the last decade, Democratic lawmakers, civil rights advocates, and other groups have been fighting the state's maps after a string of legal challenges, arguing that tactics taken by the Republican majority put voters of color at a disadvantage. Is a repeat predicted this time around?
Yep. Yeah, that's probably going to happen. So the system we have right now is just absurd. When you said the better part of the last decade, like it was literally up until like a few months ago that litigation like finally got wrapped up. You know, this once a decade thing that we're supposed to do took the whole decade to fix the maps. And during that time, you know, there's legislative sessions going on. There's policy decisions being made by people that were elected under illegal maps. You know, it's not like we're going to go backwards and fix those policy things. But you know, the important thing here is, well, there's lots of important things, but one of the sort of big macro things is that this is not a new thing that's happening this decade. It happened the prior decade and the one before that. Like, the problem here is partly the current people that are in power, but it's also that we're letting the people draw the maps who are then running under those maps. There are a lot of different reforms we could try to adopt to fix the process, but you know, that's one of the biggest problems is, like, do we expect them to all, again, try to draw maps that are going to maximize their own power? Like, well, of course they are. That's just kind of the nature of how power works, right?
And one of the things for the first time in many decades is there will be no federal oversight of the map drawing process. Can you explain that? Why does that make sense or not?
Right, but yeah, thank you. Because it doesn't. There's, so the federal government, the courts, the Supreme Court have all just like, we've gotten pretty well screwed on all of this. There is no longer, after the Shelby decision, pre-clearance in Texas, so you don't have a Justice Department where you would go take an illegal map and say, like, this doesn't look right, and they have to sign off on it or not and send it back. The other big piece that sort of falls under, I think, what you were asking is Common Cause v. Rucho was a recent Supreme Court decision where a lot of us in the reform world were really hoping, like, this is it. This is where the Supreme Court is going to bail us out. They're going to fix partisan gerrymandering. And they went in a different direction. They basically said, like, no, partisan gerrymandering is not judiciable. It's not. They basically said, like, this is a problem too big for us to fix. There's too many political questions involved. We can't do it. And the way this ties to the documentary we just saw about how there's so much action going on in the states on reform, the other thing that the majority opinion said that was written by the conservatives was, we can't fix this problem, but also we don't really need to because there's so much stuff going on in the states. People are going to independent commissions, states are passing partisan gerrymander standards. They seem to be sort of figuring this out for themselves, so we're going to leave it to them.
Yeah, so speaking of reforms, let's backtrack on that a little bit. Many people believe adopting public interest criteria and an independent commission for future redistricting should be a priority in 2021. Is it too late to do that in Texas, or is there a better solution to ensure fairness in the voting process or the redistricting process? Could we see gerrymander reform in Texas or something that looks like it?
Yeah, so there's a lot we can do. If you're thinking about what could affect this immediate next round of redistricting, that one, it's complicated. You can't do an independent commission because in Texas, that piece of the statute lives in the Constitution, so you have to, like, go to the legislature, pass a joint resolution, and then go to a constitutional amendment like the one that we're having right now. If y'all haven't voted yet, constitutional amendment election is going on today. But what we can do, there's a few things. First of all, in Houston today, there's a field hearing. The House Redistricting Committee is going around trying to get input. And these are actually really important. Like, people can go and talk about their communities of interest and just talk about, like, me in this neighborhood and all of my neighbors, like, we have shared interests that we want to be kept together so that we can have a voice in electing our candidates of choice and, like, advocating for our interests. And there's a bunch of sort of transparency things that we in the sort of the advocacy world are doing. There was a bill passed last session that really kind of slipped under the radar, but basically it is going to make a lot of the communications between legislators, their offices, and the legislative redistricting, some of the people that work on the maps, they are now going to be possibly not open to the public, whereas previously they were discoverable and through a variety of means. So we're working on trying to sort of unveil, sort of crack through that law, see what exactly we can and cannot get our hands on, because a lot of the litigation is going to later depend on, like, what was done intentionally, like was there intentional discrimination and was there just discrimination in effect, which can seem like, if I got punched in the face, doesn't matter if you meant to do it intentionally or if you only did it in effect, but there's legal reasons why that does matter. But the other thing, and this is sort of being, like, kicked around, and a bunch of really smart sort of House and Senate rules people are trying to think about whether or not you can do this, is in Ohio, there's a requirement that you have to have a supermajority to pass any legislative plan. And that's important because it really forces parties to work together. Like, not only is it a supermajority requirement, but the minority party has to be comprised like 50% or like 50% of the minority party has to be part of that. So in Texas, like, we can't do an independent commission to affect the next round of redistricting, but you could conceivably have House rules or Senate rules tweaked in a way that could change the threshold for how you do that. And it's not unthinkable. We certainly are going to have a new House Speaker in the next legislative session, and Democrats need 9 seats to take the majority of the House, so that is a viable thing that could conceivably also happen. So yeah, there's a lot of sort of paths to immediate reform, and then a lot more as far as, like, long-term things we're working on.
Well, as long as we're talking about long-standing problems that desperately need solutions, concerns over voter ID stipulations still linger for many people who fear disenfranchising minorities and other groups here in Texas. I know this has been something that your group has focused a lot on. This is an issue that continues to play out also in courts over recent years. Where are we now with that, and what's being done to make sure that system is more fair?
Voter ID in particular. So there's still work being done, especially trying to pass legislation to allow people like university students to use their college ID as a form of identification for voting. If you're a Native American, you're still not able to use your tribal ID for voting. We're working on that one as well. But I think, sort of the biggest all-encompassing thing is one of the things we're working on right now while people are voting is having volunteers at the polls who are assisting people when they run into problems. And one of the most common problems we see all over Texas is people that are just confused about voting standards, like voting requirements. And I would argue that's a thing that is not an accident. Our state just puts no resources or much effort, besides for people like Dana, who just take it upon themselves to do it. But the state itself doesn't really put a lot of effort into educating poll workers, making sure there are uniform standards all over the state, making sure that the posters that they put up and they send out to counties actually have the correct information on them. Like, these are all things that we see every election cycle that are just like, oh, that's the wrong information, or that election judge is asking for the wrong piece of identification. So trying to be proactive and filling that information gap that the state leaves, that the Secretary of State has no interest in sort of filling. I think when you think about just kind of like voting, voter ID laws, sort of voter suppression stuff, and things that are happening in that realm, one thing that I think is really encouraging from this last legislative session, and it also sort of applies to gerrymandering and all the reforms we're working towards, is you look at stuff like that SB 9 bill, some of the really bad voter suppression bills. I feel like in previous legislative sessions, that stuff would have passed. It would have passed without like that much trouble. The person that closed in the documentary was Karen Hobart Flynn, who is my boss at Common Cause. She talked about how we're in this moment where there's just an unprecedented level of energy and passion behind democracy issues. And I think we saw that in this last legislative session. I think that was one of the reasons why all of us in the advocacy world were able to come together and really kind of like get attention on this. But also, there were just Texans who were just mad. They were just like, this does not seem right. Like, they're trying to criminalize mistakes on voter registration forms. That should not be a thing they should be allowed to do. And legislators, advocacy groups, everyday Texans, like everybody sort of rose up and killed a bill that I don't think would have happened in previous sessions. And that kind of passion, like it's not going away. Those same people like want to see gerrymandering reform, and they want to see like money in politics reform, and that's, I think, a really encouraging sign for the future.
All right. Well, at this time, I'd like to invite Ross and Rick to come back up to the stage as we open up the floor for questions from the audience for any of our panelists about the documentary or any of the issues we've discussed tonight. Please stand, and one of our volunteers will bring you a microphone. Share your name and then share your question, please. Who's first?
A couple more chairs. Okay.
Not everyone all at once. Yes, back there.
And then I'll ask my question. Can you guys hear me? I have a super loud voice, so
Great.
even without the mic, you probably can. Hi, my name is Gina, and my question is actually for Senator Winfield. And I'm not sure how long you've been in office, but I'm really intrigued by the system that you have in Connecticut, with the public funding. And so my question for you is, is it just there's this pot of money that the government provides, and I understand it's like this leftover money that they find from these fees that are unclaimed. So does it vary each election cycle? Like, you don't know how much you have to spend or is that pot sort of static? Like you always have the same amount, I guess, is what I'm asking.
The amount that you get is written into law. So what happens with the pot, there's an estimate of how many people are going to be running, and that's kind of how the pot is determined. Although I will say, in some of the attempts, they've tried to take some money away from the pot to discourage people from thinking that there would be money there.
Right. No, that's what I'm wondering, because it does seem like it would be a little scary to be like, okay, I'll agree to doing this, but then the pot is so tiny that I can't. And then the other question I had for you about that was, so the private donations you get to even get into the race, how much do you have to actually get?
So over the course of years, that has varied. So when the program began, if you were a state representative, you did the contributions between $5 and $100. You had to raise only $5,000. I think it was 150 of the contributions had to be inside your district, and then
Okay.
the state would match, depending on whether you had a contested race or not, up to $25,000, which gave you $30,000, which sounds like nothing.
Right.
But because everybody was participating, it was sustainable. It's something that, if looking at it from the outside, you would think there's no way you could run this race, but
Right.
it worked. And on the Senate, it was the same types of rules. It was 300 people in your district, and I believe you had to raise $15,000, and you would get somewhere in the line of $85,000 to $90,000, depending.
Okay, really interesting. Thank you.
Who's next? Back there, yes.
Hi, my name is Jarrett. I'm a student here, and my question is for Anthony in particular, but anyone else can definitely chime in. So when you were talking about the mismatch of accountability standards for different counties across our state, that's something I feel very strongly about. I'm from Smith County, and so just now moving here, the offices are definitely night and day. There's just different opportunities between both, different standards with how it's operated and everything like that. So what necessarily is the solution to fix that, where all of our counties are matched standards and it's all operating at the same functions?
So that's a lot. There's a lot. Okay, so just a couple answers. Okay, so first, one really exciting piece, one exciting thing I can tell you is, and if you look at the big counties around Texas, places like Travis County, Harris County, we have an amazing Harris County Judge, Lena Hidalgo. There's people in San Antonio, Dallas, kind of in Fort Worth. If you're looking to try to find the places where there are local leaders who are really trying to push democracy reforms forward, trying to make it easier to vote, to register to vote, to trying to expand countywide voting, it's in all those places. There's some really amazing local stuff happening. Really not at the state level, but lots at the local level. I mean, the big answer to your question is there's got to be more pressure and systemic change at the state level. Having a Secretary of State who's not just openly hostile to voting rights would be awesome. We do have a new one right now who I'm not going to say it. We're still getting to know the new one. But it's, there's some really cool local stuff happening. And the other place I would point you is one of our really good allies, the Texas Civil Rights Project, who I think there's a couple people here. They and a few other allies put together a campaign called Democracy from the Ground Up, that if this is the thing that you're passionate about, I would check them out. They have a whole campaign dedicated just to going county to county and trying to get basically voting reforms passed.
It was Democracy from the Ground Up, you said?
Yep, yeah,
Okay.
I think that's the website too, democracyfromthegroundup. Something.
Thank you.
Ross, is there anything you could add to that? I mean, you've covered urban counties and smaller counties, and Ross, you.
So say it again,
Yeah,
I'm
is there
sorry.
anything you can add to that? I mean, Dana clearly kind of goes above and beyond what many local or county elected leaders do. Is there encouragement, on the horizon from a state level?
They get some. I mean, a lot of this is, what Rick was talking about when we were talking right after the film. When you go to the legislature, you're asking people who are beneficiaries of the current system to change the current system. And they like the current system. And you have to give them some either, great disincentive to do nothing, which, if the public's outside with torches and pitchforks, that's one way. Or you have to say, what you're doing is illegal and you have to change it. And, that's been sort of the function of the Voting Rights Act and of the, pre-clearance and all of those things, getting, mostly but not solely Southern legislatures to do things they would not otherwise do. That mechanism's gone, and so you have to now look at it and say, what is it about voting law or elections that you can change in the state legislature, that you can get past the current beneficiaries, and that's actually beneficial to voters? And, one of the things that's happening in Texas that I'm watching very curiously is in 2018 we had an unexpected surge in voting. In Texas for years, I guess this is true everywhere, voting goes way up in presidential election years, down in gubernatorial election years, back up, and you can chart it over 40 years like that. And so we expected on that basis that in 2018 we'd get 5.7, 5.8, 5.9 million voters, and we got 8.3 million voters. We got a presidential level turnout. And this year, going into 2020, we suddenly have Republicans, both as a party and as office holders and legislators, suddenly very interested in doing what has been a Democratic program in registering voters and getting people out to vote who haven't been voting before, because 2018 scared the devil out of them. And, so they're responding, in some ways they're responding to market conditions. But right now, if you ask me if I have great hopes for change from the legislature just because they're good guys, no. I mean, they're good at what they do. They got elected this way. But if you change the circumstance, if you have a market condition, whether it's a bunch of people with pitchforks or a bunch of people with ballots, then they'll move.
Or you have a scandal, which you happen to have at the moment.
Right.
But the question is the scandal too far away from election time? I mean, since you don't have an election basically for the legislature for another year, is it going to matter?
Right.
But I mean, part of what happens is public pressure really matters at a time when some issue, some problem crystallizes the anger that voters have on a slew of issues. They may be angry about voter rights, they may be angry about precinct places that Dana was talking about, they may be angry about gerrymandering, they may be angry about money, but if suddenly somebody has got their hand in a cookie jar and everybody says, oh, let's fix that, let's get rid of that. And that's when you get a sense of momentum and something happens. And then, I should have said this to you earlier, when you get a victory in a state, then there's a real desire to go on. I mean, in Michigan right now, they're already rolling on into 2020. And in New Mexico, they actually did quite a bit in 2018. They're rolling on into 2020. And in Washington State, they're now talking about other things. So victories have a cumulative effect on the psychology of people who would like to see change. Right. But sometimes it takes some issue, some miscreant, somebody with their hand in the cookie jar to trigger it.
Dana, what do you think? Yeah.
Well, I would like to add just one thing to this conversation, and that is that I really think it's important when we start looking at how each of the counties in Texas performs and whether we have some equity from county to county throughout the state, to say, follow the money. When the Help America Vote Act was passed, one of the things that it did was create the Election Assistance Commission, which then gave a bunch of money to each of the states to say, go forth, reform your procedures, start having training classes and training materials, and buy new equipment. And here's money to go make that happen, and here are some rules that you have to follow for the future. Shortly after that happened, there was then an attack on this agency to hobble it and make it not work for the future. And that lasted for about 10 years. Now it's sort of picked up a bit. The agency started to function again. And what Congress should do, and I really think there's going to be some pressure for this to happen, is that Congress should reinvigorate this agency and charge it with creating a fund, an ongoing rational fund that says, look, we know we're going to have to replace voting equipment every 10 to 15 or so years, just like everybody replaces their car every 10 or 15 years. We know this is an ongoing expense. We should plan for it. And we should also involve the states in this plan to take care of this ongoing predictable expense. So everybody should plan to have this budget money, and we do not rely on individual counties that have various sizes of budgets and various means to be able to handle this all on their own. It should be supported at the federal, state, and then local level. And if all of their money were not diverted away in budgets every late 20 years to buy equipment on the cheap, late in the game, then we could invest more local funds in having the kinds of training programs and voter outreach that we should be providing every election. It would move those resources to where they should be, instead of us pretending like, oh, gee, do we have new voting equipment that's coming up every 15 years? I guess we should plan for that.
And you're rolling out some new equipment right now that should last quite a while.
It should last. Our previous system was 18 years old. We have, this is 100% locally funded for $9 million. It should last for another 15 to 20 years. But we, Travis County voters, should have expected federal and state funding for this. We should not have to fund this exclusively through local taxes.
And just to explain what the technology does.
It is a touch screen system. Touch screen has obviously improved a great deal over the last 18 years. We use a system that all of our voters use equally, so there isn't an ADA accessible device that has one unit in every polling place and it's parked over in the corner and maybe or maybe not it gets set up. We all vote identically, and in addition to the touch screen ballot marking device, which gives you unambiguous marks on each ballot, it also produces a paper trail, which is then a hard artifact that can be audited later, and Travis County will be designing the new procedures for risk limiting audits that are going to be invented here and then shared with the other 90 counties that have purchased this same paper trail system, so that they can then begin using this this ballot card paper trail system with an auditable record of every single election. We're happy to be a part of that new system, and we're hoping that voters are going to really pay attention to their paper trail, their ballot card, by voter verifying it before it gets put in the ballot box. We get to use best of both worlds, because as long as we have electronic support with the touch screen, then we can continue to bring you, obviously, early voting, but also vote centers. We couldn't do that without electronic support.
In a state where voter fraud is a concern and voter error, could be eliminated, this is something that should help greatly.
This is a very big step in the right direction, having a voter-verified paper trail. It's what voters have been asking for 15 years. Finally, we have manufacturers that are giving voters what they've been asking for.
Great. Any other questions? Yes, you right there in the California Berkeley shirt.
Hi there. Thank you. My name is Michael. I'm not from California. I'm from New Zealand originally. But this has been fascinating. I have a question, I think maybe more for Dana and Anthony, but certainly curious to hear from everyone. The Texas Railroad Commission is an extremely important, directly elected institution in Texas. And yet, I think a majority of Texans probably don't know what it is and what it does. So I'm curious, short of changing the name, which seems to be perennially deferred, are there things that can be done in terms of educating Texas voters about what the Railroad Commission does, why it's important, and why they should care about their railroad commissioner?
Well, I know KXAN and the Texas Tribune have covered this issue extensively. It is very confusing because the Railroad Commission has nothing to do with railroads, but it does have some of the most powerful regulators of any industry in Texas on it, and it can be very political. And we have uncovered plenty of things that have been ethically questionable with it, but legislation continues to pop up every year to try to reform this, and it's just one of those things that I believe is going to have to continue session after session until someone pays attention to how important that this agency really is. Ross, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think no, that's kind of covers it.
Yes?
So it's, I don't really have anything that's going to help answer the actual question you asked, but how that actually relates to some of the money and politics stuff that we've been talking about. The people who do understand what the Railroad Commission does really, really well are the people in the industry who just throw gobs of money at those statewide elected officials. It's crazy the amount of money they raise relative to some of the other statewide elected officials that are much more prominent. But as we're thinking about sort of money and politics and where the opportunities are where we can actually pass some reforms like what they're doing in Connecticut, I think that's an opportunity. There's I think it's Rafael Anchia out of Dallas has a bill he files every session that would reform that. I think maybe also we in Texas are also moving towards eliminating straight ticket voting. This will be the first time that we don't have an election that has straight ticket voting, which is going to have a massive effect on judicial races. So I think there's also a really good chance that we'll be moving to nonpartisan judicial races at the local level, which I also mentioned just because there's also a really good chance that those now might consider having some kind of public funding option, because right now they're funded entirely by like coordinated Democratic or Republican campaigns at the county level, which that money's not going to be there in the future.
You asked me earlier, Ross, about what triggers things And I was just thinking, you think about things like railroad commissions, or you think about regulatory commissions in states. In some states, New Mexico in particular, they've triggered reform movements when there's a particular scandal about that. They go beyond, the normal fix is to go replace somebody who's caught with their breaking the law or making conflict of interest type decisions and be done with it. But the really smart reformers say, well, no, let's fix the way we pick those folks, and you get a reform out of that. And you might even say, well, maybe not in the case of the commissions, but in the case of judges, why don't we publicly fund judicial races? All I'm saying is often there are wedges that are open in commissions and judgeships and so forth, where you don't think that's going to be where reform starts. It's not where you, if you were drawing a map up, you would say that's where I'm going to start. But suddenly there's an opportunity, and it defends the public sense of fairness in a very fundamental way. And it doesn't touch the big power immediately, so it begins to make a kind of reform acceptable. That's going on in a bunch of states. We talk about public funding in Connecticut. There are only 4 states that have public funding statewide for legislatures, Maine, Arizona, Minnesota, and Connecticut. But there are 20 states that have some kind of public funding, and about 10 or 12 of them have it for judicial races, and others have it for some other races. All I'm saying is that sometimes a partial step into reform off something like commissions or judgeships is a way into the reform process.
Yeah, let me add something a little cynical here. When you have something like the Railroad Commission, which is basically regulating oil companies in an oil state, there's a sort of, you're far enough down the ballot, and if you're subtle enough with your regulation, if it's far enough removed from things that we all understand every day, then you can get away with an awful lot of stuff before you rise to the level of people really paying attention to something and continuing to pay attention to it over time. The problem with judges in some cases, particularly in big counties like Harris County and Dallas County, is that the ballot is so long and they are so far down the ballot that you get down there and you start looking for harmonious names instead of people you know or people whose resumes you actually understand, or you use the device, and this is actually the argument for straight ticket voting. I don't know anything about these judges, but I trust my party, right? We just got rid of straight ticket voting in Texas. It's going to be interesting to see if the heavy smokers make it to the end of the Harris County ballot. There was somebody from the Harris County Clerk's office last election held one up, and I think she was 5'10", and the ballot was taller than she was. So, some of this is that it's so far down the ballot, and I care about the stuff at the top, and I care less and less, and I know the sheriff, and then I'm out. And you can sneak a lot of stuff through a ballot like that. You can sneak a lot of things past voters who are otherwise pretty attentive.
Any other questions? Alyssa? Sure. Down here.
This is for anybody who wants to answer it. In Austin, we have seen quite a few different propositions that are on the ballot that wound up there as a result of citizen-driven local ballot initiatives. What do you think the role is of citizen-led petition drives in affecting the type of change that you guys are seeking?
Yes, it's huge. It's amazing. Texas at the statewide level should have it. I'm not sure if it's all the reforms, but most of the reforms we saw that we were talking about, most of the big democracy reforms we see around the country are usually states that have the ballot initiative process. Austin, the city of Austin, and the state of California are the two that have the best model independent citizen redistricting commissions in the country. Both of them were through the ballot initiative process. And there's a bunch of people right now talking about doing some ballot initiative stuff in Austin having to do with a form of public financing called Democracy Dollars based on a Seattle thing. It gives us definitely a form of kind of citizen participation that makes it easier to achieve reform as opposed to, what was mentioned a minute ago about legislative reform is all about I'm going to go try to talk to the people in power and try to convince them to give up a little bit of power, which is obviously harder.
But there can be concerns about citizen-led reforms like that to make sure that they are going to be effective policy, that there is at least enough expertise behind them to actually get done what needs to get done, correct?
I think that you can see around the country that there are a number of reforms that are being enacted through ballot measures in cities. I mentioned last year public funding in Baltimore, Phoenix, Denver, and Portland, Oregon. There are a bunch of other cities that have. New York City has it, Los Angeles has it, Seattle has it, there are a bunch of other cities. One of the interesting and sort of troubling dynamics in American politics today is that cities are blue or progressive or whatever, and state legislators are red. And whether or not you're talking about in Birmingham, literally raising the minimum wage of workers in Birmingham, and the Alabama legislature then subsequently passes a bill that says cities cannot raise the minimum wage except for their contractors or something like that. And I wonder, as you all think about what could be done in Austin, which is a city where reform would be natural on a number of fronts, what the risk is of pushing for reform that you can win in a city and then getting a blanket refusal and veto from the legislature, not just on that city, but on a whole bunch of other cities, and whether or not you have to think about those dynamics.
It could never happen here.
Yeah, I can't think of one time.
Oh, we had a sick leave policy that did exactly that. You know, Austin and a couple of other cities passed sick leave policies, and the legislature, wanted to go into that. We're having a battle now over taxes. The state wants to legislate how much the cities can raise their taxes or not raise their taxes. We had a fight over ride shares in Austin with the legislature.
Plastic bag ban.
We should have a fight over scooters, personal bias, sorry.
Trees.
Right. I mean,
It's really
it's a persistent
It's a
problem.
really tough problem. I mean, this is happening all over. Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh did the same thing as Birmingham, and I'm deliberately picking cities and states that we haven't been talking about in the past. So this issue is coming up a lot. But the other thing is, look at the world right now. Look at Hong Kong. I mean,
Right.
and then look at Ecuador. And then, I mean, it's around the world. There's this sense of democracy just sort of, we're tired of this, people sitting on our heads. So, I mean, it's a moment. And, how many students are there at the University of Texas? 50, 60, 70,000? I don't have any idea. But this is a hell of a mass of people. And, if I were here and mischievous, I'd want to find out what issue was, tickled people and affected people. And you have to sit around, maybe you have to wait. But I would have thought that ballot initiatives at the city level are pretty productive. There's pretty good evidence that they're happening. And in some states that have adopted reforms, right now Oregon is going through a whole phenomenon. Portland has done several reforms and they want to take them statewide. Seattle did some reforms that trying to take them statewide. So there is a multiplier effect that happens when something, but I mean, this is not the biggest city in the state. So, I mean, you got Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and El Paso to cope with, but still, cities can lead the way. And the fact that you've got a ballot initiative on the books that allows you to do it, even to change the city charter or to change the city, it's an opening.
And one thing that's just, I want to mention because it's, I think, a really encouraging thing along the lines of what you just mentioned, exactly what you said, to be scared of did happen in the last legislative session. We were working on this Democracy Dollars project for the city of Austin. We're nowhere near passing it, but a pretty senior state senator tried to preemptively kill it, just like prevent any city in Austin or any city in Texas from being able to use this type of public financing. But like SB 974, which is the one she introduced, we were able to kill that bill. And I think we're still working on getting positive things passed in Texas at the legislative level, but we're getting pretty good at killing back real bad stuff that's going to make us go backwards. So hopefully that continues to be true.
All right. Well, thank you to our audience for those questions, and thank you to everyone on stage for taking part tonight. As our panelists stand and exit, I would like to introduce Talia Stroud, the director of the Center for Media Engagement here at the University of Texas.
Barely hear you.
That was an elegant out.
Thank you so much for that. The Center for Media Engagement is delighted to have joined the LBJ School, KXAN, and Texas Tribune in sponsoring this event with the Solutions Journalism Network, one of the funders of the film that we got to see tonight. What an honor to see a preview of Democracy Rebellion and to hear from Pulitzer Prize and Emmy Award winner Rick Smith. Thanks also to all of the panelists and for you for coming out tonight to join the discussion. Tonight's film and this discussion encapsulate what we at the Center for Media Engagement are calling connective democracy, the vital connections between the public and policymakers that are facilitated by the media. When the media serve their critical role in a democracy, they act as a conduit between the governed and the governors. They expose systems that are not working, they reprimand those not acting in the public interest, and they raise awareness about efforts to produce change. Yet when we look at the media today, there is so much that should concern us. Local newsrooms face a challenging economic reality. Partisanship can lead people to very different sources of information. Misinformation makes it difficult for us to know what to trust. When we think of the topic of tonight's discussion, election reform, there are also reasons for concern. According to polling from the Pew Research Center, nearly 2/3 of the public and majorities of Democrats and Republicans believe that it is very important that people who give a lot of money to elected officials should not have more political influence than other people. Yet one follow-up question where people are asked, do you think that this is happening in the United States today? And very few people think that that's the case. Discussions like this help to raise our collective awareness. There are hopeful signs. Our conveners for this evening, the Solutions Journalism Network, have been working with newsrooms to show how critical reporting techniques can be used to investigate solutions to problems facing our communities, states, and nation. By investigating possible solutions, how they're being implemented, and whether they're actually working, journalism can play an important role in pushing forward this great experiment we call democracy. Our research at the Center for Media Engagement here at the University of Texas has analyzed this form of reporting, finding that it can inspire citizen involvement and interest. And indeed, that's exactly what we hope you take away from this evening. So thank you so much for coming out, and thank you to everyone for participating in this event.